advance. Oh, let's see. We tested this out. It's not working. There it goes.
There.
So for this evening, what I was hoping to go over was a little bit of an introduction to me and sort of my background, a little bit more than what Matthew just gave out, and talk about kind of what a delta is generally, and then dive into our delta, the California Delta, Sacramento-San Joaquin, talk about some of the birds of the delta, some threats to the delta, and then go over kind of the ongoing process of recognizing the delta's importance and restoring it to sort of parts of its former glory. So with that, as far as my education goes, I was originally homeschooled from preschool until I started going to college, where I went to junior college in College of Marin. So you will see a Marin theme coming up from time to time here. And then, went to UC Berkeley and UC Davis. In between Berkeley and Davis, I did some internships. I worked for a variety of different bird research-oriented groups as an intern, sort of bouncing all across the country for a couple of years. And then after graduate school, I got a job briefly with the Department of Water Resources, and then a much longer stint with the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, which is where I got a lot more kind of appreciation and a deeper understanding of the Delta, the amazing place that it is, the complications that it faces. And living in the Delta and working in the Delta, I really became quite fond and quite attached to the place. And I currently work for the Wildlife Conservation Board, which I've been at for almost 4 years now, where I focus on stream and river restoration projects across the state of California. Beyond my sort of professional educational side, I'm also a big fan of science communication. I think it's super important. I get a lot of personal value out of it. I think it is valuable to others as well, especially when it's done by people better than me. But I take a swing at it through a variety of different ways. I have a blog that I've written for many years. I've written for other popular science magazines and others' websites. I have, like Matthew mentioned, a YouTube channel, and I'm also active on a variety of other social media platforms. So I'm very findable, and I'm really trying hard to get the word out about birds and nature and science and about how amazing this planet that we live on really is. And then I also do stuff in person. I lead bird walks pretty frequently. I'm also involved with the Birdathon. I have been leading a team, participating in and then leading a team with Point Blue Conservation Science for 20 plus years now. We are the Drake's Beach Sanderlings, a really cool, dedicated group of young birders. It's a youth birdathon team. And we have a great deal of fun every year and go out and see a ton of birds across Marin County. And then my latest endeavor is writing a book, Birds of the California Delta, which has been a really exciting sort of outgrowth of both my science communication work and also my love of the Delta. So it was a sort of a perfect merging of those two things. I was really, really fortunate to connect with Martha Espinosa, who's an incredibly talented scientific illustrator from Costa Rica, and who I worked with on some smaller projects, and who I connected with through Instagram. So one of the amazing benefits of social media and the connection that the internet can give us. And so after working with her on a small project here or there, when this larger project came around, I reached out to her and asked her if she would be interested in doing all the illustrations, and she said yes, and I was absolutely delighted. And so she's the creative engine behind what makes this book beautiful. And then it's published by Heyday Books, which has been a great partner with this book and has a solid legacy in producing books on a variety of nature, sciencey kind of topics. In particular, this book was actually the fourth in a series that they are creating on what they call hyperlocal birding, which is a phrase that I like quite a bit. And it's where they find a birder or illustrator or bird illustrator who's can write a book because they're really familiar with a really small geographic area. So the first one is Birds of Berkeley. And the point of the books are not to be an inclusive, comprehensive guide to every species you're going to see in this area, but rather the book sort of brings to light 25 species that really characterize that location. And so with mine, it's exactly the same format. I was tasked to pick 25 species that really exemplified the Delta and write about them and highlight them in this book. And so that's what I've done. And through all of that, through all of the education, through all of the jobs, through all the science communication, I believe very, very strongly that birding is for everyone, nature is for everyone, science is for everyone. And so I've tried very hard to sort of make the platforms that I'm on as inclusive as possible and to encourage others to do the same. I've definitely gotten a lot out of birding, personally and professionally, over the course of my life. And I think that everybody deserves the same opportunities if that appeals to them. So, getting away from me, what's a delta? We talk about the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta a lot, or at least I certainly do. But what is a delta? It's a tract of sediment deposited at the mouth of a river, which might sound weird when you're thinking about the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and we'll get to that in a bit. But they form this particular shape, this fan, kind of in the shape of a triangle, at the mouth of a river. And in fact, if you look at other rivers around the world, here are three famous big ones, they each form their own sort of special triangle. And so it's these regions that are the deltas of those particular rivers. Now, why delta? Where did the word delta come from? Well, the shape of a triangle is the shape of the fourth letter in the Greek alphabet, or at least the capital form of the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet. There's alpha, beta, gamma, and there it is, delta. And so since people observed that when rivers reach a larger body of water, a lake, an ocean, they spread out and often form this triangular shape, they figured, well, triangle, it's a delta, we'll call it delta. And so that's how it came to be. Our delta is a really special place for a whole slew of reasons. I mean, it's the center of California geographically. Sort of, if you look at the map of California, right smack in the middle. And it's also the heart of California's water system. It's home to a hugely diverse set of habitats, which support a hugely diverse set of species. And it's this really complex network. If you look at the California Delta in any kind of detail, you'll see that it's this network of dozens of islands with well over 1,000 miles of waterway twisting and networking in between them. It's a very complicated landscape, which makes it really interesting in a lot of ways. But of course, if you look at our delta, it's not really a triangle. And that's because we have this unique set of geologic historical events that have formed California and so formed the delta along with it. 100 million years ago, plate tectonics shoved up the Sierra Nevada mountains. And for a time, that was really the western escarpment of any kind of mountains on the continent. The Sierras were there. The rivers from the Sierras flowed downhill onto a wide, flat plain that just flowed down to the ocean. But then about 5 million years ago, things changed. This little thing called the Farallon Plate crashed into and then sort of crumpled under the edge of California and pushed up a second mountain range, sort of crumpled up the edge, which is what we now call the Coast Range. And in between, it left this sort of wide, flat area. That wide, flat area then filled with ice during the last ice age. And not only did the oncoming and then eventual retreating glaciers smooth out a lot of the Central Valley, but they also carved out things like Yosemite and left their marks on many parts of the Sierra. So about 10,000 years ago is when that ice finally retreated, and it left behind what we now kind of know as California, Coast Range, Sierra Nevadas, and in between this really broad, flat area. And as that ice left the mountains, and as that ice left the Central Valley, there was space for water to start flowing out of those mountains and forming rivers. Lots and lots and lots of rivers. We have so many rivers in this state, and impressively, a ton of them through either coming off the east side of the Coast Range, or more of them and bigger ones coming off the west side of the Sierra Nevada, flow together into the Central Valley, into one another, and form the delta that we know today. And those rivers do something really interesting. They bring down a lot of inorganic sediment from those various mountains. And then, of course, as they hit the valley floor, they form wetlands, and plants grow in those wetlands. Those plants die, and that organic matter from the dead plants mixes with the inorganic matter from the mountains. And they all kind of form this melange together. And they don't go anywhere because of the Coast Range and because of the narrow outlet that is the Carquinez Strait, being really the only way that water can flow out of the Central Valley. It means that this mix of organic and inorganic material can't really go anywhere. And so it's laid down as the rivers flow down, layer after layer, as those plants die, layer after layer, and they form these peat soils. And peat soils, we're going to come back to peat soils over and over again, because peat soils really underlie everything that makes the delta the delta. They're very high in nutrients and carbon. And remember that fact, the fact that peat soils are high in carbon is going to have a big impact on the delta that we know and sort of what has become in the delta, and also what is probably going to happen in the delta in the future. That really nutrient-rich peat soil is great for agriculture. People have been growing things in deltas for a very long time, and ours is no exception here. We produce so much food by growing plants in our delta. It's amazing. Almonds, pistachios, grapes, rice, so much food is produced on these incredibly thick, incredibly rich soils. And of course, outside of what the humans use for it, these peat soils are also great for supporting a huge range of habitats. We've got everything from wetlands to open water to rivers, forests, vernal pools, open grasslands, you name it, we got it. Which is one of the reasons why it's fun to sort of cruise around the delta, because you can really easily bounce from habitat type to habitat type and have a really fun birding day, among other things. And of course, that huge range, huge diversity of habitats includes a huge diversity of living organisms, from plants, many of which are found native to California, some of them almost exclusively in the Central Valley, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. We got insects, again, some insects endemic to California's Central Valley, found nowhere else on Earth. We've got fish, both migratory and residents, and we've got birds, migratory and resident. All of these things spending at least some of their life cycles in some part of the diverse place that we call the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And particularly for birds, one of the reasons why there is so much diversity in the Delta is because of its placement on the Pacific Flyway. As I'm sure many of you know, the Pacific Flyway is this giant, almost like interstate freeway that links large portions of the globe. As you can see, it spans 3 different continents. And it's used by millions of birds every year. Well over 300 different species use at least some portion of it. And while not all those species are going to use every single mile of that freeway, many, many species use at least different stretches here or there. And that's why the Delta is so important. So the Delta is smack on the Pacific Flyway, which means that it's important as a stopover place for birds that are migrating through, either going south for the winter or coming back north. A place to stop, a place to feed, a place to rest, so they can be ready for their next leg of their journey. And it's also a destination for a lot of birds. Many birds from up north leave when it gets cold, with the express purpose of coming to the Delta to spend their winter. On the flip side, many birds from down south come up to the Delta to breed. And in fact, when you take all those together, you get about 250 species of bird that spend some time in the Delta. And they really can be kind of divided into like these four sort of big types. There are these summer visitors who come from usually places south of us. They come to find nesting habitats. They come to find mates. They come to raise babies, the next generation of birds, before departing back south. Winter visitors, usually from up north, like I said, come here to rest and refuel. And it's been shown more and more that what happens to a bird on its wintering ground actually has quite important carryover effects to its next migration and even into its next breeding season. So if a bird has a rough winter, that will often impact how successful it's going to be at reproducing the following summer. So coming to the Delta and being able to have a really good winter means that they do really well on their breeding grounds. Then, of course, there are the visitors just zipping through on their way to and from places. And the fourth group are the birds that realize that, hey, the Central Valley, the California Delta is a pretty neat spot. Why not just stay here all year long? And so they do, the year-round residents. Now, for better or for worse, there are groups tracking birds. I would say all the way for the better, but the one downside is that sometimes we learn things that are not quite as pleasant. And the State of the Birds report is a report put out by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The 2025 State of the Bird report just came out recently. And it ranks birds sort of at a population level into different categories based on their population trends. So they've got the green birds, which are healthy and happy and good. There are yellow alert birds, orange alert birds, and red alert birds. And the red alert birds are kind of where we often face the uncomfortable truths. Red alert birds, and I'll just read off their quote here. They're birds with perilously low populations and steep declining trends. So birds, there are not a lot of them, and they're going down fast. And we have 5 of those species in the Delta. And those are kind of the 5 that I would like to talk about now. One is, and I'll be honest, I was surprised to see this as a red alert bird, but the yellow-billed magpie. This is a year-round resident in the Delta. It's a California endemic. This is our bird, found in California and nowhere else on the planet. It likes grassy savannas, where it nests in big trees most of the time, and sort of these loose colonies, which are really fun to get into. They've also adapted pretty well to many human-dominated landscapes, such as this individual that I photographed sitting on a fence, chain link fence. And they have a bunch of threats. West Nile virus, in particular, is disease that seems to hit a few groups of birds harder than others, and corvids are one of those groups. So being a member of the corvid families, the ravens and crows and jays, magpies are definitely frequently hit by West Nile when we have bad West Nile virus outbreaks. They're also omnivores, so they eat tons of stuff, which includes rodents sometimes. And if those rodents ate rodenticide, these birds can get sort of secondarily poisoned, which is definitely something that has impacted the yellow-billed magpie population. And habitat loss will be a recurring theme. Those big trees they nest in often get cut down for various reasons. And so habitat loss is sort of a continuing threat for them. The tricolor blackbird is another exciting bird and a tragic one to see on the red alert list, but not entirely surprising. This one is a near endemic. It's almost only found in California, but there are a few little populations that go outside the border. This one historically nested in wetlands like cattails and tules, willows, and they have managed to sort of branch out a bit into agricultural fields, things like rice and some other grains. But unfortunately, that actually kind of puts them in conflict with humans in some ways, which I'll get to in just a second. This is definitely a migratory species. It's here in the Delta during the breeding season, where they breed in massive colonies. This is one of those birds, like the passenger pigeon and some others, which seem to really do well to breed when there are a lot of other birds they are breeding. They sort of feed off each other. If we jumped in a time machine and went back 100 years, you could find nesting colonies of 300,000 individuals all piled together into giant fields or marshes, all breeding together. To put that into perspective, right now there are about 300,000 total tricolored blackbirds in the entire population. So a pretty disturbing, pretty steep decline. A lot of the birds that do breed in the Central Valley migrate out to Outer Point Rays, and they hang out at the dairy farms way out at Outer Point Rays. And so you can often in the wintertime go and see masses of tricolored blackbirds. It's quite a spectacle. If anybody hasn't done that, I strongly recommend. Go out, look at those giant flocks of blackbirds, and realize that most of them are going to be tricolored blackbirds. It's a pretty special thing to see. With those population decline has meant that the state of California has listed them as threatened, and it's under consideration for federal listing. What's going to happen now at this point with the federal government is anybody's guess, but it was certainly on the list for consideration. And getting to threats, the loss of wetlands to agriculture is certainly a big thing. But like I said, many of them have managed to use agricultural fields of various kinds. But the conflict there arises because if you're a farmer and you have a wheat field or a mustard field or something, and you end up with a population of tricolored blackbirds nesting there, the nesting period often overlaps with the harvesting period. And so that means that we're sort of boxed into this tight place of, well, what does the farmer do? The farmer maybe gives up on their income, on their entire crop, just counts as a loss, but it preserves the birds. Or if they harvest, you get almost total nest failure, reproductive failure for that colony of tricolored blackbirds. So it's a tight spot to be in either way. And certainly finding the balance point between those two pressures is an ongoing effort. And then, of course, there are more and more humans in California. It's a great place to live, as we all know. And so creating more urban areas and suburban areas often encroaches into wetlands as well. And so that's another threat faced by this bird. The third red alert species is the Ridgway's rail. I will be honest, there's an effort going on that is trying to change the names of birds away from being named for people and more being named after characteristics of the birds themselves. I'm a big fan of this effort. And one of the things that first popped into my mind when I first heard this effort was, oh, that means we can get rid of Ridgway's rail. For whatever reason, not an easy word for me to say. So getting rid of, I'm sure Ridgway, I don't know much about Ridgway, but I'm not a fan of his name. Again, only found in California in a few different places here and there, and then also scattered into a little bit of northern Mexico. It lives in tidal wetlands. This one is federally threatened, and threats include habitat destruction, predation by invasive species, and also domestic animals, dogs, and in particular cats, when they are left out, can often get into and eat the eggs and babies of Ridgway's rails because they're ground nesting, and so they're very sort of accessible to an active predator. Yet another reason to keep your dogs on a leash and keep your cats indoors. And not only the other threat these face is, since they are tidal, they're living in the water, there's often lots of pollution in water, and so contamination has been recorded as another driving force for the decline of the species. They're very vulnerable to levels of aquatic pollution. Mountain plovers are a really cool species, misnamed entirely. They do live in mountains, but even in mountains where you're going to find these, are in grasslands, little prairies, high mountain prairies, stuff like that. That's where they breed, and they come down to winter in places like the Delta, wide open meadows, wide open cattle ranches, wide open grasslands. They arrive in the Delta in early November and they stay through the winter. So this is a winter visitor. And really, very little is known about their migration. They obviously breed up in the mountains. They breed to places north. They winter in the Delta and other places farther south. But how they get from point A to point B, it's a big empty space in our knowledge. Habitat destruction, again, or conversion to housing and other forms of agriculture is definitely one of the big drivers, big threats to this species. I mean, they need these big open grasslands. And in some ways, that sounds like a great agriculture kind of environment. And they do very well in things like cattle pastures. But if a farmer decides that I'm actually not going to do cows anymore, I'm going to convert my land over to almond orchards or to vineyards, those kinds of habitats basically offer no value to a mountain plover at all. And so those kind of agricultural conversion processes do not favor this species. And also, because they spend so much time in agricultural lands, they're often exposed to quite a few pesticides. And so here's another place where sort of contaminants from pollutions can impact their reproductive success, impact their survival. And finally, the last one is the Allen's hummingbird. So we've in the list of our red alert species, we've had birds that are residents, birds that breed here, birds that winter here. This is an example of a bird that migrates through the California Delta. They nest almost exclusively in this very narrow band of the Oregon and California coasts. And they winter in this very selected spot, very selected region right in the middle of sort of central Mexico. And in between those places lies the California Delta. And so we get them sort of zipping through in fall and spring in small numbers, but they come through. Their population is declining pretty fast, pretty precipitously, unfortunately. And this is again due to habitat loss, because kind of that, the places that they like to live, that Oregon coast and California coast, it's a place that we like to live too. It's a beautiful area. And unfortunately, not only does building houses and cities and stuff in that area take away habitat from the Allen's hummingbird, but it also means that it kind of plays on a sensitivity of theirs. Allen hummingbirds don't like humans very much. In particular, they don't like to breed around humans very much. Some hummingbirds, like Anna's hummingbirds, very, very tolerant of humans. Nest in people's backyards, on people's windowsills, all sorts of places where people are very active walking around and they don't mind at all. That is not true of the Allen's hummingbird. They like their space. They are a really great example, though, of why it's important to plant nectar sources, because if you have a yard that's even decently sized and can provide some food sources maybe farther away from the house, they may very well hang out there, a little bit more isolated, a little bit quieter, a little bit farther from human disturbance. And if you can provide some food for them there, it will really benefit the species. And that's true if you're on the breeding ground, on its migratory path, or if you happen to have a place in Mexico on the wintering grounds. So those are some of the hot button species in the Delta right now. Those species and many, many others, birds, fish, many other species, the whole ecosystems of the Delta, are facing several significant threats. And I want to sort of go over a few. This is sort of the downer part of the evening, but I promise we'll pick up at the end. So invasive species, subsidence, saltwater intrusion, and development. 4 of the big issues in the Delta. For invasive species, the Delta is one of the most invaded ecosystems in North America. We're right up there with like the Everglades level invasion. We've got tons of different kinds of animals, from mammals like nutria to birds like starlings and house sparrows to invertebrates like the zebra mussel, which has been around for a while, and the brand new invader, the golden mussel, which is poised to really spread, take over, and dramatically change kind of how nutrients cycle through the water column, have big impacts on our native animals and plants. Speaking of plants, we have lots of invasive plants too. Water hyacinth, which in this bottom picture are these sort of large, fleshy leaves in the front with a little splash of color there. It's one of their flowers. Water primrose is that sort of more yellowy green vegetation in the background. Arundo is another big one. It's this giant cane that grows 20, 30 feet tall, destabilizes levees, takes over areas, burns like crazy when it dries. Definitely a big problem. And so controlling all of these different invasive species is a major undertaking. It is not easy to control these things. To quote Jurassic Park, life finds a way. And invasive species are no exception to that. They're, in fact, incredibly good at finding a way. And trying to stop them requires a lot of diligence, money, yes, time, effort, an ongoing issue. Subsidence is kind of a special Sacramento Delta kind of issue. We have shrinking, sinking land. So this top picture here is kind of what Native Americans 1,000 years ago would have experienced the Delta as. An area where, yes, there is sort of larger channels of water where there are major rivers, but in between those areas, the land is pretty much at water level. The whole area is pretty wet, pretty marshy. Smaller channels that move around here and there, lots of marsh plants growing all over the place. Much of the Central Valley was just marshland. Tons of tules, tons of cattails, growing, dying, laying down more material, mixing with that inorganic from the mountains, and just creating more and more and more soil. When Europeans got here, they knew that deltas are great places to grow food. They recognized our delta as the same. And so they started draining the sort of more island parts, the more landy parts in between those main rivers. They had to do that because most plants, especially most of our crops, don't really like to grow in marshes. They drown. And so they need a little bit drier soil. So what people start to do is they start to pump water out of these areas, the interiors of an island, to dry out some of the soil and then grow crops in. But you remember back when I said peat soils are really rich in carbon, that was going to be important to remember? This is where it comes in, because peat soils do something weird when they dry out. They get colonized by a whole bunch of different kinds of bacteria. And these bacteria, this is going to sound slightly crazy, but it's one of those things, it's crazy but true. Those bacteria consume the carbon matter in soil and release it as carbon dioxide gas. Kind of just like we do, right? We blow out carbon dioxide gas every time we exhale. But these bacteria are so effective at it that it actually reduces the volume of carbon in the soil. And so the soil sinks once it dries out. And of course, that just means the soil level is lower. That means that generally people have to pump out more water, more soil dries out, the bacteria colonize that, and it gets even lower. And like I said, this may sound nutty, but we've got islands in the Central Delta that are now 30 feet below the water level because all of that matter has been converted into gas and floated away. The Delta is actually a pretty significant part of the state of California's greenhouse gas emission contributor because of this oxidizing soil, because of these bacteria in that peat soil. And of course, losing that soil in the middle of islands means that the levees on the side, the edges of those islands, become walls holding back rivers, holding back the ocean. And the farther down that soil sinks, the more pressure there is pushing in from the outside, that heavy water pushing in, leading to levee failures potentially. Throw in a bit of sea level rise, And the potential for levee failures just goes up and up and up. And of course, once an island floods, it's very hard to undo that. It's difficult, it's sometimes dangerous, it's very expensive. So we've sort of set ourselves up now where we've got these almost like a reverse bathtub. The inside of the bathtub is the dry interior of the island, and the entire bathroom is flooded with water, pushing in. And now we're trying to figure out, okay, what do we do about this? Dropping sea level isn't a realistic option. So it seems like the only real option is to build that soil back up. Reversing subsidence is a long, slow process. It is possible. It definitely is possible. By planting tules and cattails, especially tules, you can kind of recreate that ancient process of wetland plants growing, dying, their materials coming and being contributed to the soil, and building up layer upon layer upon layer, and building that soil back up. Rates are usually in like the maybe inch or so a year. And so if you have 35 feet of volume to make up, you can see it's going to take a while to actually do that. But it's probably the best long-term solution. So subsidence is the sort of ongoing issue, ongoing threat to many of the islands in the Delta. And the map over here on the side kind of shows the depth and sort of where the lowest points are. The darker the color, basically the more red, the farther down that land has shrunk. And this is actually a bit of an old map. This is, like it says at the top, in 1995. So sort of all those areas have dropped lower since then. It makes for a rather surreal experience when you're standing in the interior of some of these islands and you're watching like a big tanker ship from the ocean cruising down higher than you are. You're looking up at boats on the water. Messes with your head. So saltwater intrusion is another thing, and it dovetails with subsidence. The way the Delta works right now, most of the time, is kind of what you see on this picture right now. All that blue is fresh water coming down from all those rivers out of the mountains. And because they're flowing down and it's fresh enough, and there's enough of that volume of water pushing out through the Carquinez Strait, that sort of fresh water flushes out and kind of holds back the salt water from the bay and the ocean. And as long as the volume of water from all those rivers is high enough, that pressure is maintained and that salt water stays in the Carquinez Strait. But when river flows tend to drop, that freshwater pressure weakens and salt water creeps in farther and farther into the Delta. This is a problem for lots of things. It's a problem for drinking water because none of us want to drink salt water. It's a problem for agriculture because most crops don't really do well in salty soil. And it's also a real problem for many of our native fish and other species because most of them have evolved for a sort of specific level of salinity. And they do well in that relatively narrow range. So if a lot of the Delta got a lot saltier, they'd lose a lot of habitat. They'd have to move into different areas if those areas were even suitable that they could reach. So it would require a lot of moving around of species that would generally make life harder for them. So saltwater intrusion is a big, big problem. And it dovetails with subsidence because if you have a deeply subsided island and you have a levee failure, odds are good that while there is certainly a lot of water coming down from the mountains, there's a lot more water in the Pacific Ocean. So most likely, when a levee fails and an island suddenly floods, it's going to pull in salt water. So it kind of ties in with levee failures and more saltwater intrusion. And then, of course, development. Like I said, we humans love California. It's an amazing place to live. And there are lots of us and more of us living here all the time. And we, of course, need places to live. And so that leads to more urban development, more suburban development, encroaching often on wetlands because they're flat areas, relatively easy to build on. And so that directly impacts the Delta. And then also with an increasing population, even beyond the Delta, beyond California, there is an increasing pressure to convert natural lands into agricultural lands to grow food to support all those people. And these impacts can really spread worldwide. The Delta is a food producer of truly global import. We certainly feed a huge number of people in California off of the food grown in the Delta. The food grown in the Delta is shipped all around the country. And in fact, within the Central Valley of California, are grown something like 80 or 90% of the world's almonds, 80 or 90% of the world's pistachios. We're one of the few places that has ever exported rice to China. So truly global impact of the food grown in the Delta. And as there are more people, just needs more food. Unfortunately, that has meant that about 95% of California's wetlands, a lot of which were in the Central Valley, most of which actually were originally in the Central Valley, have been destroyed. Which means that, as you can see between these two maps, that is a greatly impacted habitat type. It means that whatever we've got left is really, really important. Now, with all of this, with the importance of the Delta to all these migratory species, to all the different habitat types that are found there, everything we've talked about, the importance of agriculture, all that stuff, it has been sort of more and more important. People have been realizing that, hey, the Delta is, the Delta is a really important place. We should recognize that. We should notice that. We should protect it. And so this has kind of gone through a bunch of different sort of levels. Historically, if you look at the Delta watershed, that's sort of this dark area on this map. Basically, any drop of water that falls as rain anywhere in that darkened area will flow into a river that ends up flowing to another river that flows into another river that ends up flowing into the Central Valley, into the Delta, and then eventually out through the Carquinez Strait. Huge area. There have been other more sort of legalistic attempts to define the Delta, with the most recent being the designation of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area that happened in 2019. This was created by an act of Congress, and it was actually the first national heritage site in California. And it was created and established to, and I'll just read this excerpt from the congressional act that created the area. It was to recognize the area's, quote, rich tapestry of indigenous peoples and immigrants from around the world, natural beauty and wildlife and engineering marvels, bustling metropolitan areas, and picturesque rural towns. And this area here on the map, this is kind of where everyone's sort of gelled around what we now consider to be the Delta. This is the border here of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area. So then, now that we've got this area working within it, a lot of work is being done to restore habitat. This is something that I've been active with my entire career. And in fact, these pictures are taken from a project that I managed in Brentwood, where you can see the before picture. There was this creek that ran through a very urban area of Brentwood. And it was engineered to basically do just one thing, and that is move floodwaters out of the area kind of as quickly as possible. And so it was fairly straight. It was steeply sided. There was not a lot of space. It was narrow, not a lot of space for that creek to sort of meander and naturally be a creek. And as you can see, very little habitat value, very little in terms of plant cover, plant diversity. And not surprisingly, correspondingly low animal diversity as well. This project, though, kind of addressed all those things. It pushed those trails and roads back a ways from the creek, kind of regraded the edges to create different levels of floodplain so that as that water comes through, instead of just rushing out, it can actually spread out across some plains, some space. The stream actually has the space to meander and be more stream-like. And those benches create areas that can be planted with native plants. And so this after picture is taken pretty recently, 8 years after we installed the habitat. And so basically these two pictures are taken 8 years apart. And so it's impressive to see it really work. It's very rewarding to be able to go to a place and say, this place isn't so hot. Well, let's make it better. And then actually see it be better. And in many ways, 8 years, it's not that long of a time. Is it expensive? Yeah, sometimes. Is it difficult work? Yeah, sometimes. Is it complicated? Yeah, it is. But it works. And that is just one example. This is a map of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy's projects. So this is the agency that I used to work for. And as you can see, there are dozens of habitat and water enhancement projects underway. There are tons more planned. But this is definitely something where you can be involved on many different levels. But one of them in particular is public pressure, is how you vote. When you see a measure or a law or a proposition or something like that on a ballot that is going to address climate change, that is going to fund habitat work or conservation, those are often the investments that get these projects done. Pretty much all of the projects that I've managed have been using bond funds or other forms of taxpayer dollars that we communally have decided as a state, it's worthwhile to put money to make these areas better. And it makes all the difference in the world. So it's something to pay attention to every time that ballots come around. And also, anytime you want to call up an elected official, you could remind them, hey, these are the kinds of things we care about. These are good things, because they work. And they really do work for birds, too. My last couple of slides here are two kind of good news stories about two different bird species in the Central Valley and Delta in particular. One is the Nuttall's woodpecker. Again, this is a near endemic, right? It's mostly in California. Loves oak woodlands, even though it doesn't eat acorns, but loves oak woodlands. And with habitat restoration, with the planting of oak groves in various places, their population is increasing. It's slight, but it's a steady increase. It's going in the right direction. So definitely a solid good news for a bird species that I know I'm always thrilled whenever I see one or hear one. And the other one is the yellow-billed cuckoo. This is a weird one because this species is found all across North America, and back east, it's doing very well. It's actually pretty darn common. But out here in the West, for whatever reason, our Western population is not. It's actually pretty darn rare. It's a riparian specialist, only breeds in riparian habitat. And of course, riparian habitats, as we saw, those sort of wetlandy riparian habitats have been impacted a great deal in California, which has resulted in just a few isolated populations being left in California, a few little stretches of river here and there where you could find yellow-billed cuckoos still breeding. And in fact, that decline has been so precipitous in the West that it's a candidate species for listing under the Endangered Species Act at the federal level. Not the Eastern population, just our Western ones. And while all that is concerning, the good news is that they respond really well to those habitat restoration projects. When people go in and plant cottonwoods and plant willows, plant the riparian woodlands that this species loves so much, they're very responsive. They come on back really fast. Sometimes in as little as 3 years after planting those plants, you'll have breeding yellow-billed cuckoos living in that new area, recolonizing, which is really, really encouraging to know. So again, are these projects hard? Are they expensive? Yes, to all those things, but they work. And that's the really rewarding part of it. And finally, I will just leave you with this quote because I love it. And it's how actually I opened my book. To hear some of our bird devotees talk, one would think that to be able to identify a bird is all of bird study. On the contrary, the identification of birds is simply the alphabet to the real study, the alphabet by means of which we may spell out the life habits of the bird. To know these habits is the ambition of the true ornithologist. And with that, be delighted to take any questions you have. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for having me. And here's a bunch of different ways of getting a hold of me and following me, doing all the things that I'm up to.